October 12th, 1838. The brush country of central Texas. Sound of wind through dry mesquite, the click of a hammer being cocked. Sweat stings the eyes of Captain John "Jack" Hayes. His hand is white on the polished walnut grip of his new Patterson Colt revolver. Beside him, 15 Texas Rangers, hard men, veterans of San Jacinto, check the percussion caps on their single-shot rifles. They are dismounted, their horses tied back, waiting in a silent, dusty ambush. They are hunting a Comanche war party that raided the settlement at Victoria. Hayes hears it first. Not a war cry, not a gunshot. A low, thunderous rumble, like distant artillery. The ground begins to tremble. Sound of 1,000 hooves growing louder. Suddenly they burst from the mesquite trees. Not 30 warriors, but 200. A solid charging wave of horse and flesh. Hayes bellows, "Fire!" Sound of a volley of rifles and pistols. The first volley cracks the air. Horses scream. Men fall from the Comanche line. But the Comanche, they don't stop. They don't even flinch. As the Rangers frantically try to reload, ramming powder, patch, and ball down their muzzles, the Comanche wave splits. It divides into 2 fluid formations, circling the Texans at a full, terrifying gallop. And then they vanish. Hayes squints into the choking dust. The riders are gone. But the horses are still there, galloping in a tight, dizzying circle, closing in like vultures. A ranger to his left screams and clutches his chest, an arrow buried to the fletching. "Where are they shooting from?" Another man yells, ramming his rod home. Hayes looks closer. He tracks a single painted horse. He sees it, and his blood runs cold. The warrior hasn't vanished. He is under the horse. This was not a rare trick. This was the Comanche lean, a standard military doctrine that made the Comanche the most feared light cavalry in history. For over a century they built an empire, Comancheria, that halted the Spanish, decimated the Apache, and held back the tide of American expansion. They did it not just with bravery, but what Miller saw that day wasn't just an enemy plane. It was a secret that would change the air war, but with a single, impossible tactic that turned a mounted warrior into a high-speed, mobile, and armored weapons platform. By the end of this documentary, you will understand how this one insane technique, combined with a revolutionary mastery of logistics, allowed a small, obscure mountain tribe to become the undisputed lords of the southern plains. Section 1. The Weapon That Changed the World. The story of the Comanche Empire does not begin in the sprawling, sun-baked plains of Texas. It begins hundreds of miles north, in the cold, thin air of the Wyoming mountains, near the headwaters of the Platte River. Before 1700, they were a small, struggling band of the Shoshone tribe. They were infantry. They were hunters and gatherers, living a hard life on foot, their world bounded by the seasons and the constant threat of more powerful, established enemies like the Crow and the Blackfeet. They were, by all accounts, unremarkable. And then they saw it. Sound of a horse whinny, distant. It was a creature that had not existed in their world. A god dog, as some first called it. This was Equus caballus, the horse. Brought to the New World by the Spanish conquistadors, it had been slowly spreading north, either through trade, theft, or escape. The real cataclysm had been the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. In that bloody uprising, the indigenous Pueblo people of New Mexico drove the Spanish out, and in the process liberated thousands of Spanish horses onto the Great Plains. It was an ecological and military explosion. Other tribes saw the horse and saw a tool. They saw a pack animal, a way to move camp more easily. They saw a platform for hunting bison, a way to get one good shot with a lance or bow before the herd scattered. The Comanche saw something different. They looked at the horse and saw a weapon. They saw the future of warfare. They saw speed, distance, power. They realized that the man who mastered this animal would no longer be a victim of the landscape. He would be its master. This realization led to one of the most profound and rapid cultural shifts in human history. The Comanche made a decision. They would not just use the horse. They would become the horse. They abandoned their mountain homes. They turned their backs on their Shoshone kin, and they rode south. This was not a migration of refugees. It was a purposeful, strategic invasion. They were heading for the Llano Estacado, the staked plains of Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. It was a sea of grass, perfectly flat, with mild winters and vast, open spaces. It was, in short, the single greatest horse-breeding and grazing land on the continent. Their entire society was re-engineered. A man's wealth was no longer measured in hides or corn, but in the number of horses he owned. His status was defined by his ability on horseback. Their infantry past was forgotten, even despised. To be afoot was to be the lowest form of human, a walker, a crawler. A Comanche boy was given a horse, often a colt his own age, almost before he could walk. His first lessons were not in tracking, but in riding. This was the first step. They had acquired the technology, and they had secured the perfect industrial base, 1,000 square miles of open-air factory for their new weapon. But this weapon came with a new problem. A man on a horse is a big, slow-moving target for an enemy on the ground. To truly dominate, they couldn't just ride on the horse. They would have to figure out how to ride as the horse. They needed a new tactic, something that would make them invincible. Section 2. The Impossible Rider. This new way of war would not be born in a general strategy tent or a government forge. It was born in the dust of the Llano Estacado, on the backs of tens of thousands of horses, and it began in the childhood games of the Numunu, the people, as the Comanche called themselves. A Comanche child's education was singular. Before he could properly walk, he was lashed to a gentle mare. By the time he was 4 or 5, he was given his own horse, usually a colt of the same age. They grew up together. They learned the world together. The boy learned to read the horse's every twitch, its every fear, its every intention. This education was brutal and constant. Young boys, naked and riding bareback, would race across the prairie. They played games that were, in reality, high-stakes military drills. A game of chicken involved 2 lines of boys charging each other at a full gallop, only to swerve at the last possible second. To fall was a mark of deep shame. Another drill involved picking up a small stone or a piece of cloth from the ground, not at a trot, but at a dead run, hanging off the side of the horse like a pendulum. Their bodies were physically molded by this life. Comanche warriors were often described by white captives as looking awkward, even bow-legged when on the ground. But the moment they mounted, they became something else entirely. They were, as one historian noted, the finest light cavalry in the world. But this was not just about balance. The true secret that allowed them to vanish was twofold: a piece of simple technology and a lifetime of specialized strength training. The technology was a single braided loop of horsehair or tough hide, tied into the horse's mane or fastened to a simple strap around its girth. It was an unassuming, primitive-looking stirrup. But its function was revolutionary. At a full gallop, 30 miles an hour across broken ground, a warrior would hook one heel over the horse's spine. Then he would drop his entire body to the off side, the side facing away from the enemy. His other foot would catch this simple loop, supporting his full weight. His hand gripped the mane. He was now suspended horizontally, parallel to the ground, shielded by the entire mass of his galloping horse. To a line of terrified Texas Rangers or Spanish soldados, the warrior ceased to exist. They saw only what appeared to be a riderless horse, charging with terrifying discipline. But the warrior was not just hiding. He was attacking. He did not carry the white man's cargador de boca, the mouth loader. That weapon was a liability. It was heavy, inaccurate from horseback, and most critically, it was slow. A skilled rifleman was lucky to get off 1, maybe 2, rounds per minute. The Comanche warrior carried the ultimate close-quarters, high-speed weapon, the sinew-backed short bow. Made of Osage orange or hickory, backed with bison tendon, it was short enough to be wielded from any position and powerful enough to drive an arrow clean through a bison, and the warrior had mastered it from his impossible position. Clinging to the side of his mount, he would draw a buffalo hide smasher arrow from the quiver on his back. He didn't aim over the horse, he aimed under its neck. Sound of wind rushing, horse galloping, and the thwack, thwack, thwack of a bowstring, in the time it took one Texas Ranger to reload his single-shot rifle. A frantic, 60-second process of pouring powder, ramming a patch, and setting a cap. The vanished Comanche warrior had fired a dozen arrows. He became a high-velocity armored archer. He was a mobile weapons platform that was both the gunner and the armor itself. This was the Comanche lean. It was the perfect, terrifying synthesis of armor, speed, and firepower. It was a tactic that rendered traditional infantry tactics obsolete. You couldn't form a square. They would circle you, invincible, and whittle you down with an arrow storm from 100 ghosts. You couldn't charge them. They would simply melt away, firing backwards over their horses' rumps, only to reform and attack your flank. They had turned the simple guard dog into the 18th century equivalent of an attack helicopter. They had solved the problem of vulnerability, but a revolutionary war machine requires revolutionary logistics. A tactic this devastating requires a constant, massive supply of the machine itself. They didn't just need good riders, they needed an endless supply of horses. They needed to control the entire industrial base of the plains. Section 3. The Engine of Empire. The Llano Estacado was not just a home, it was a machine. This vast, flat, grass-rich expanse, which the Spanish called a sea without a shore, became the engine of the Comanche Empire. The tactic of the Comanche lean was the lethal product, but the horse was the raw material, and the llano was the factory floor. The Comanche did not just herd horses, they industrialized them. While other tribes measured their wealth in dozens of animals, the Comanche measured theirs in thousands. They became the most sophisticated large-scale horse breeders on the continent. Their manadas, their herds, were legendary, grazing on the endless buffalo grass, guarded by young boys who, as we've seen, lived in the saddle. They practiced selective breeding with a ruthless efficiency. They gelded inferior males, traded away weaker stock, and captured wild mustangs, constantly infusing their herds with new, tough bloodlines. They prized different horses for different tasks. There was the common, tough-bodied buffalo horse, trained to run straight and steady, ignoring the chaos of the hunt. There was the long-distance, traveling horse. And then there was the war horse. These were the elite. Fast, agile, trained to respond to the slightest pressure of a knee, and, crucially, to charge fearlessly into the sound of gunfire. But breeding alone was not fast enough to fuel their rapid, explosive expansion. The Comanche military machine had two fuel sources. One was their own herds, the other was everyone else's. They became the greatest raiders and thieves the New World had ever seen. The Spanish settlements in Texas and New Mexico, with their sprawling haciendas and mission ranches, were seen by the Comanche not as towns, but as stores. They were vast, poorly defended supermarkets for horses. The raids were masterpieces of light cavalry warfare. They were timed to the Comanche moon, the autumn full moon that lit the prairie, allowing war parties to travel hundreds of miles at night. Sound of distant, nervous cattle, a single dog barking. Imagine a Spanish rancho south of the Rio Grande. A handful of vaqueros sleep. A single sentry walks the perimeter. He hears nothing. The Comanche war party does not announce itself with a cry. They ride with their horses' hooves muffled in buffalo hide. They are a whisper in the tall grass. The attack is not a siege, it is a shattering. Sound of a sudden, high-pitched war cry, gunfire, horses stampeding. The war party, perhaps 200 strong, explodes from the darkness. They do not attack the hacienda itself. That is a waste of time. They go for the corrals. They go for the remount herds. They use terror as a tool, firing arrows and muskets to stampede the animals. In a cloud of dust and chaos, thousands of Spanish horses are liberated and driven north at a full gallop. By the time the Spanish soldados can organize a pursuit, the Comanche are 50 miles away, already crossing back into the Comancheria, their stolen goods melting into their own vast herds. This relentless, systematic raiding served two purposes. First, it armed the Comanche, providing the gasoline for their military. A single warrior would ride into battle with a string of 3, 4, or even 5 fresh horses. When one mount tired, he would leap from its back to a fresh one at a full gallop, remaining perpetually faster and more mobile than any opponent. Second, it disarmed their enemies. They didn't just steal the Spanish horses, they stole the Spanish economy. They stole their ability to hunt, to travel, to trade, and most importantly, to fight back. They systematically dehorsed their rivals, grounding them, rendering them helpless. With this unending supply of horsepower, the Comanche transformed from raiders into an economic superpower. They became the central hub of a trade network that spanned the continent. They sold horses to the Kiowa and Cheyenne to the north, to the Wichita to the east, and even, through intermediaries like the Comancheros, to the very Americans and Mexicans they were raiding. They had achieved a perfect, violent, self-sustaining loop. They used horses to steal more horses, which made them rich enough to buy guns, which made them even better at stealing horses. They had built the engine. Now they would aim it. Section 4. The cleansing of the plains. They aimed it first at the established power of the southern plains, the Apache. Before the Comanche migration, the Apache were the undisputed lords of this domain. The Lepan and Mescalero Apache bands were themselves formidable horsemen, a people who had terrorized the Spanish settlements of New Mexico for a century. They occupied the very lands the Comanche now coveted. The Llano Estacado was not empty. It had to be taken. What followed, beginning in the 1720s, was not a war in the European sense. It was a decades-long campaign of total annihilation. It was a clash of two military doctrines, and the Comanches was simply superior. An Apache warrior was a formidable fighter, but his worldview was different. He was often semi-agricultural, tied to specific rancherias where women farmed corn and beans. He might own several horses. A Comanche warrior was a pure, nomadic hunter-killer. He was tied to nothing but his herd, and he might own 100 horses. This logistical gap was the difference between victory and extinction. Sound of a crackling fire, distant, pained cries. Consider a typical engagement near the San Saba River, circa 1740. An Apache war party spots a Comanche raiding band and gives chase. The Comanche, appearing to be few in number, flee. The Apache, eager to defend their territory, pursue them for miles across the high plains. The Apache horses begin to foam and labor. Then the trap springs. The Comanche warriors, at a full gallop, leap from their exhausted mounts onto the fresh war horses they have been leading. Their flight becomes an attack. The Apache on their winded animals are suddenly the prey. They are encircled by riders who seem to be immune to fatigue. They are cut down with arrows fired from beneath the necks of fresh, screaming horses. But the true, devastating blow comes at the same moment. The fleeing Comanche party was a diversion. The main Comanche war force, hundreds strong, has used the diversion to bypass the Apache warriors and slam directly into their undefended rancheria. This is not a battle, it is a slaughter. The Comanche do not just steal horses, they erase the Apache's ability to live, they burn the cornfields, they kill the elders, they take the women and children captive. These captives are the other fuel for the Comanche engine. Young Apache boys would be adopted, beaten, and re-educated, raised as Comanche. They would be taught the lean, taught the language, and in a generation they would be raiding their own kinsmen. The women were integrated, forced to become Comanche wives, literally breeding the Apache out of existence. This was a new, terrifying kind of warfare. It was systematic displacement. The Spanish in San Antonio watched this genocide with a sense of relief, and then dawning horror. For decades, the Apache had been their primary tormentors. Now, this new power from the north was solving their Apache problem. Spanish reports from the 1740s are filled with descriptions of starving, terrified Apache refugees begging for protection inside the Spanish missions they once raided. The Comanche had, in effect, created a vice. The Spanish pressed from the south, and the Comanche hammered them from the north. By 1750, it was over. The Apache were broken. They were shattered, driven from their ancestral homelands, forced into the scorching deserts of Arizona and the mountains of New Mexico, the arid Apache lands we know today. The Comanche had not just defeated the Apache, they had replaced them. The Great Sea of Grass, from the Arkansas River in Kansas to the Rio Grande in Texas, now had a new name. On Spanish, French, and eventually American maps, it was given a title that was both a political reality and a stark warning: Comancheria. This new empire, 250,000 square miles, was a mobile fortress of grass and horses. It was a no-go zone for Europeans. It was ruled by a council of warrior bands, united by language, culture, and a shared military doctrine. They had achieved total regional dominance, and now, with their old rival eliminated, the Comanche turned their full, undivided attention to the two European empires encroaching on their borders: Spain and, just over the horizon, the fledgling United States. Section 5. The Unstoppable Storm. The Comancheria was now a recognized sovereign power, but it was not a power that respected the lines drawn on European maps. To the Comanche, the Spanish settlements in Texas and the haciendas of northern Mexico were not a border. They were a pantry. What began in the 1760s and escalated for the next 80 years was not war, but a harvest. The Spanish Presidio system, a chain of forts designed to stop Apache infantry raids, was hopelessly obsolete. These static, mud-brick forts were like lighthouses on a coastline, utterly incapable of stopping the sea itself. The Comanche simply flowed around them. This was the era of the Great Raids. War parties, sometimes 1,000 warriors strong, would gather in the Comancheria. They would ride south, crossing the Rio Grande, and plunge deep into Mexico. Not just 100 miles, but 600 miles. They struck Durango, Zacatecas, and San Luis Potosi. They were a red storm that fell upon ranches, towns, and silver mining convoys. Sound of a bell ringing frantically in the night. Distant screams. A Spanish soldado at a small garrison would peer into the darkness, hearing the rumble. He was trained to form a line, to fire a musket volley from a wall. He was not trained for this. He was not trained for a force that moved at 60 miles a day, striking 3 separate targets at once. He was not trained for an enemy that needed no supply lines, living off the bison and the very cattle they were stealing. And he was certainly not trained for the Comanche lean. The Spanish volley would crash. Sound musket volley. The Comanche line would dissolve. Warriors, hanging invisible on the far side of their horses, would charge the garrison walls. The soldados, desperately trying to reload their 12-pound escopetas, would suddenly find themselves pin-cushioned by arrows fired from below their own firing slits. The attack was over in minutes. The horse herds were gone. The captives were taken. The warriors had vanished back into the northern desert before a pursuit could even be mounted. This relentless raiding broke the Spanish frontier. It bled northern Mexico white, depopulating entire provinces. The Spanish Empire, one of the most powerful in the world, was fought to an absolute standstill. They sued for peace. In 1785, they signed a treaty with the Comanche, a treaty that was, in reality, a surrender. Spain agreed to pay the Comanche regular gifts, tribute, in plain language, of weapons, cloth, and ammunition, in exchange for a promise they would stop raiding them and focus on their enemies. The Comanche had forced a European empire to pay them protection money. Then, a new people arrived. In the 1820s, the Anglo-Texans began to arrive, led by men like Stephen F. Austin. They were different. They were not subjects of a distant king. They were farmers, frontiersmen, and speculators. And they brought a new weapon, the American long rifle, often called the Kentucky rifle. It was the sniper rifle of its day. It was accurate out to 300 yards, far beyond the effective range of a Spanish musket or a Comanche bow. The Texans were marksmen. They believed their technology and their tactics, dismounting, forting up behind wagons or trees, and firing with lethal, deliberate accuracy would make the difference. They were wrong. Sound of a single, sharp rifle crack, followed by a human yell. Battle of the Niches, 1839. A small band of Texas Rangers caught in the open, dismount and fort up in a small copse of trees. They check their powder. They know the math. 1 shot per minute. Make it count. The Comanche war party, led by a young, ambitious para-rivo, or war chief, appears on the horizon. They do not charge in a straight line. They split, fanning out into their signature circling attack, galloping at full speed just outside of effective rifle range, taunting the Texans. A ranger, a veteran named Elias, picks his target. He waits for the warrior to circle closer. He leads his shot, compensates for the wind, and squeezes the trigger. Sound rifle crack. The warrior tumbles from his horse. A cheer goes up, but the cheer dies in their throats. The Comanche accelerate. They charge the position. Elias frantically tries to reload. He pulls his powder horn. He fumbles for a patch. He's only 15 seconds into the 60-second reload. And the Comanche vanish. Elias looks up. All he sees are 50 painted horses, riderless, circling his position at a dead run. He hears the high, ululating war cry, but it seems to come from the ground, from the air itself. Sound of dozens of arrows thwacking into wood and flesh. The man next to him grunts and falls, an arrow through his throat. Elias looks on in terror. An arrow skips off the dirt in front of him, fired from an impossible angle. He sees it now. Under the neck of a charging pinto, he sees the face of a warrior, screaming, knocking another arrow. The Comanche lean had perfectly neutralized the Americans' single, devastating advantage. The long rifle was useless if its target was a 4-inch wide warrior's leg, shielded by 1,000 pounds of horseflesh, moving at 30 miles an hour. The Texans were overrun. The Comanche tactic was not just a trick. It was the ultimate counter to the slow-firing infantry weapons of the day. For 3 decades, this imbalance held. The Republic of Texas could not defeat them. The United States Army, when it arrived, could not defeat them. The Comanche were the masters, their empire at its zenith. But in 1836, in a small factory in Paterson, New Jersey, a man named Samuel Colt had just patented a new invention. It was a revolving pistol, and it was about to change the math of the plains forever. Section 6. The Great Equalizer. The first Paterson Colts were not impressive weapons. They were .36 caliber, finicky, prone to chain firing, and notoriously slow to reload. A man had to practically disassemble the entire weapon to seat new percussion caps and load powder and ball. The U.S. Army looked at it and, for the most part, passed. But the men of the newly formed Texas Rangers saw something different. They saw their own salvation. Among them was Captain John "Jack" Hayes. He had not forgotten that day in 1838. He had not forgotten the feeling of utter helplessness, of fumbling with a powder horn while vanished warriors fired at will. He saw the 60-second reload not as an inconvenience, but as a fatal, tactical void. The Colt Paterson, for all its flaws, closed that void. It was, as the Comanche would later call it, a 5-shot rifle. Hayes equipped his small company of 15 men with 2 revolvers each. This was his great innovation, not just the gun, but the doctrine. He trained his men to fight not as dismounted infantry, but as cavalry. He would meet the Comanche on his own terms, on horseback, in the open. He would turn the white man's greatest weakness, the reload, into a terrifying 10-shot strength. June 8, 1844, Walker's Creek, Central Texas. Sound of a single distant gunshot. Hayes and his 14 Rangers are tracking a large raiding party. They are deep in Comanche territory. They are, in fact, being watched. The Comanche war chief, a celebrated warrior named Yellow Wolf, sees the tiny band of Texans. He sees an easy kill. He lays a perfect trap. A single Comanche scout appears, taunts the Rangers, and flees into a rocky valley. Hayes, against all conventional wisdom, orders a full-speed pursuit. They gallop into the trap. Sound of high-pitched war cries from all sides. Suddenly, the ridges on both sides of the valley are alive. Not 20 warriors, not 40. Over 70 Comanche, all painted for war, all led by Yellow Wolf himself. They have the high ground, and they have the numbers. This is not a battle. It is an execution. Yellow Wolf gives the order. The Comanche charge. This is the moment that has broken Spanish presidios and Texas militias for a century. The Texans are supposed to panic, dismount, and try to fort up. They are supposed to fire one panicked volley. Hayes and his men fire their single-shot rifles. Sound a ragged volley of rifles. And just as Yellow Wolf expects, the Rangers drop the useless, empty weapons. The Comanche warriors surge forward. This is their moment, the 60-second void. They drop into the Comanche lean. They vanish to the offside of their horses, knocking their arrows, preparing to ride through the fumbling white men and pin-cushion them as they try to reload. They are shielded, invincible, and moving at 30 miles an hour. But Hayes does not order a reload. He doesn't order a retreat. He screams, "Charge!" Sound of galloping horses, mixed with the sharp crack, crack, crack of revolvers. Hayes and his 14 men charge into the 70 Comanche. A warrior, hanging beneath his horse's neck, lines up his first arrow on a ranger. He is 10 yards away. He is invincible. The ranger doesn't have a powder horn. He has a second gun. He points his Colt Patterson and fires. Sound, crack. The .36 caliber ball tears into the warrior's exposed shoulder. The warrior, stunned, this should not be happening, tries to recover. The ranger fires again. Crack. The warrior falls from his horse, dead before he hits the ground. All across the valley the same scene is repeated. The Comanche lean has suddenly, catastrophically failed. Its entire purpose was to exploit the reload gap. With the revolver, there is no gap. A warrior hanging exposed on the side of his horse is no longer an armored gunner. He is a stationary point-blank target for 5 consecutive shots. The Comanche are thrown into total, uncomprehending panic. Their impossible tactic, their most sacred military doctrine, is not just failing, it is getting them killed. They are fighting men who seem to have endless firepower. Hayes himself charges directly at Yellow Wolf. The chief fires his musket. The shot misses. Hayes levels his Patterson. He fires, and Yellow Wolf falls dead. The battle becomes a rout. The Rangers, screaming, reloading on the fly by swapping to their second revolvers, chase the shattered Comanche for miles. When the dust settles, over 20 Comanche, including their leader, are dead. The Rangers have 1 man wounded. The news of Walker's Creek traveled across the Comancheria like a shockwave. A tiny group of white men had not just survived a Comanche attack. They had charged a superior force in the open, beaten them at their own mounted game, and broken the Comanche lean. The technological gap was closing. The great equalizer had arrived. But the final destruction of the Comancheria would not come from a gun. It would come from an enemy that was even more relentless, more systematic, and completely invisible. Section 7. The Unseen Annihilation. The first invisible enemy had been stalking the Comancheria for decades. It wasn't a soldier, it was a virus. While the Comanches' nomadic lifestyle and relative isolation had protected them for a century, their massive expansion and raiding deep into Mexico had exposed them to the white man's most devastating non-military weapon, variola major, smallpox. An epidemic in 1848, and another of cholera just after, ripped through the Comanche bands with a ferocity that no rifle volley could match. This enemy didn't care about the Comanche lean. It didn't fear a warrior on his war horse. It entered the lodges. It killed the women who processed the buffalo hides. It killed the elders who held the political and social fabric together. And most critically, it killed the children, the next generation of riders. The U.S. Army, based at new forts like Fort Worth and Fort Belknap, watched this biological catastrophe with cold, strategic interest. Their reports back to Washington noted that the Comanche's greatest strength was much reduced by disease. Their population, once estimated as high as 20,000, was in freefall. The great equalizer, the revolver, had leveled the tactical playing field. Disease had begun to hollow out the empire from within. But the final, systematic destruction of the Comanche way of life would target the very engine of their power. It would target their food, their shelter, their economy. It would target the American bison. After the Civil War, the United States turned its full industrial attention westward. Generals like Philip Sheridan and William Tecumseh Sherman, fresh from their total war campaigns in the South, were given command of the West. They understood something that the Spanish and Texans had never fully grasped. You could not defeat the Comanche by chasing them. The Comancheria was a fortress of grass, and the Comanche were the most mobile human beings on the planet. As Sheridan famously, and perhaps apocryphally, stated, the only way to solve the Comanche problem was to destroy their commissary. As long as the bison existed, the Comanche warrior would have food, he would have a teepee, his horse would have a saddle, and his bow would have sinew. The policy was simple. The U.S. Army would not just allow the slaughter of the buffalo, it would encourage it. Sound of a distant massive boom, a long faint whistle, and a wet thud. This was the sound of the new war. It was not the crack of a revolver. It was the deep-throated roar of the Sharp's big .50 caliber rifle. The commercial hide hunters arrived. Men like J. Wright Moore and Buffalo Bill Cody. They were not soldiers. They were businessmen, and they were armed with a weapon that, once again, rewrote the rules of war. A Comanche warrior's entire doctrine was based on speed, mobility, and the 60-second reload. The Comanche lean was a close-quarters tactic, designed to operate inside 100 yards. The Sharp's rifle could kill a bison at 800 yards. It was, in effect, portable artillery. Sound of a man coughing, wind, the metallic click of a rifle action. A hide hunter would not charge. He would not engage. He would find a high ridge, set up his tripod sticks, and lie down. He would wait. When the great, endless herds of bison appeared, he would begin his work. Boom! A lead cow falls. The herd, confused, gathers around it. Boom! Another. Boom! Another. A skilled hunter could kill 100 animals from a single stand, never moving, a mile away from any potential threat. The Comanche watched this from a distance, in a state of horror and disbelief. Their tactic was useless. They could not charge a man a mile away. They could not vanish from a bullet they never heard coming. They were watching their entire world being skinned. The railroads, pushing west, provided the final industrial component. The hunters killed. The skinners took the hides. The railroads shipped millions of them back east to be turned into machine belts and coats. In 1870, an estimated 30 million bison roamed the plains. By 1880, they were virtually gone. The Comanche were no longer the lords of the plains. They were starving. Their invincible war horses, with no bison grazing, grew weak. Their society, hollowed by disease and now crippled by starvation, began to collapse. The final desperate uprising was the Red River War of 1874. Led by the last great war chief, Quanah Parker, himself the son of a captive white woman, the Comanche and their Kiowa allies made a last furious stand. But they were not fighting soldiers. They were fighting a void. They were a cavalry with no food, no horses strong enough to fight, and no hope. In June of 1875, Quanah Parker led the last band of free Comanche, the Quahadi, into Fort Sill, in modern-day Oklahoma. It was not a treaty. It was an unconditional surrender. The U.S. Army, in a final symbolic act, rounded up the Comanche's remaining horses, the descendants of the god dogs that had built an empire. They separated the best of the war ponies, over 400 animals. They marched them into a ravine, and shot every single one. Sound of a single distant gunshot, echoing, then fading to silence. The Comanche lean was a tactic of genius. It had allowed a small, obscure tribe to dominate a continent for 150 years. But it was a tactic entirely dependent on an ecosystem, a sea of grass, a million bison, and an endless supply of horses. In the end, the Comanche were not defeated by a better cavalry. They were defeated by an invisible virus, an industrial rifle, and the total, systematic destruction of their world. The story of the Comanche is a stark reminder that the most dominant military tactic in history is only as strong as the world that supports it. Their mastery of the horse was absolute, but they were ultimately undone by a new kind of war, one that didn't just kill warriors, but destroyed the very means of life. What part of this incredible and tragic story amazed you the most? If you found this history as fascinating as we do, please share this video with a friend and subscribe for more hidden stories and lost chapters of our past.